Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us in person and all of you online. It's great to see so many people here. This is Nectar's July Clinical Governance Day. The agenda may change slightly as we go through the day, depending on availabilities and clinical needs, but we've got the morning and that looks pretty set. So we're starting off today slightly themed about major incidents with a little bit of extra about endobronchial obstructions and other interesting cases. Just the usual rules, Chatham House rule applies. You can talk about the cases here without mentioning anyone or identifying anyone personally, including the patient, obviously. More talking about the learning here. There will be a break for coffee in a bit, but our first chat is going to be about major incidents. We've got John McKenna here. It's been a bit of a theme over the last, year really, where Nectar has been called in an ad hoc manner to assist with a sector-wide major incident of some sort, be that a pigeon-based bomb scare or a genuine electrical emergency. And we have often said afterwards in the debrief that we need to formalize some sort of SOP, or at least have a shared mental model with regards to what the role of the Nectar consultant is and what the role of the Nectar team is, depending on the size of the wave and its nature. And so John's been working very hard on this in combination and alongside some exercises at the Royal London and some work done by the ODN. And hopefully we'll be able to have a robust discussion about what our role is and maybe even talk through a scenario with regards to our intentions and plans. So feel free to contribute as we go along. You guys will be part of any response that we do have, and we do want to hear from you. So without further ado, John, one of our next consultants, will be taking off. Oh, and you may be on Twitter, by the way. So if you object to that, shout.
Okay. Okay, so this is I've got a reasonably long time slot. I'm not going to talk for all of it, but I think there's quite a lot of interactions. You may disagree with what I'm going to present or have alternate ideas, and actually that's welcomed. This isn't a finished article by any means, and there's a little bit of more questions than answers, and some very, very big questions that I can't necessarily answer myself. So there'll probably be more discussion than presentation. But as John alluded to, what can we do in a major incident? How can we assist? Because people are asking for us and for our help, but it's unclear as to what our remit is and what it isn't and what we can and can't do. And actually, this is a problem. So I think if you just sort of look through some headlines, there's stories from hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina and so on, necessitating hospital evacuations and critical care evacuations in the States. There has been evacuations in hospitals here. This was a while ago, but this is the famous Marsden fire in their operating theatres. I don't know what happened regarding the evacuation of this hospital and how that was done and how it was done on a practical level. But I do know that this became very real to us last year. We've had electrical failures here. We've had flooding at Whips and Newham. And what we're headed for a big massive heat wave on Monday and Tuesday. So we'll try and get this out before that. But actually, on a slightly environmental climate change note, if this is a problem, we're going to have infrastructure failure. And we need to have a bit of a think about where we slot into this. So what can we offer as a service? So I kind of use this, there was a talk about what are the basics that you need to provide healthcare, and this was from the Ebola pandemic. And actually I find it quite useful to sort of structure my thinking around the COVID response, for example, and debrief. But this is essentially what you need to provide healthcare. You need staff, you need systems, you need space, and you need stuff. So just talking through all of those in reference to Nectar themselves, do we have the staff to, we'll talk about evacuate a ITU? No, we don't. we just think about the duty crew, so we don't have enough people to evacuate in intensive care. So what sort of staff do we need? We need ambulance staff, we need medical staff and nursing staff. So by ourselves, we can't provide that and we can't guarantee that. Another thing that's really important, and we noticed this from the call-ins before, is all of us have day jobs. And actually, if a major incident is called in one hospital, there is a reasonably good idea that a lot of us will actually be dealing with it anyway, in some capacity. So I think the only reliable source of staff we have is the duty staff who are dedicated to do that on that day. Other than that, the rest of our cohort of people who we work with, so the other registrars, the other nurses, the other consultants, can't be relied on. That's not to say they're not factored in, but we have other commitments. Do we have space? Oh, that's interesting. Yes and no. So it depends what you think about space to provide healthcare. So in this discussion about what are the basics to provide healthcare, you basically need somewhere to do the healthcare. So is that and in ITU, this is essentially a critical care area. But actually, what do we really need? Oxygen and electricity and shelter. Do we have those? In terms of the space we work in, we have one ambulance, so we don't. But can we make it and create it? Yes. So we can source it and we can find it. So we don't necessarily have staff. We kind of don't have space, but we can we can manipulate that and make that happen. So yeah.
Space is two forms. If you can car park people safely, briefly,
yeah,
actually the physical space in transport isn't such a bottleneck. But if we can't car park them somewhere functional with shelter, oxygen, electricity, then it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, I think I guess it's the thing. There's sort of the car parking them where we before they leave. There's the physical space of the movement, but then there's the spaces to where we're moving them to. So I think we can facilitate making that happen, but it's not immediate. We don't have a spare hospital or a fleet that we can actually decant everyone into. Do we have stuff? No. So
it's going well.
It is going well, isn't it? Do we have the stuff to evacuate intensive care? No, we don't. And actually, this is a big problem. So we have the equipment we have, and we have the equipment to manage one critical care transfer at a time with some redundancy. We don't have the equipment or the drugs or everything to manage multiple critical care transfers, so we don't have the stuff. Do we have systems? Yes. And actually, this is something we do have that the other sites won't necessarily have immediate access to. So we have, we've got training, we've got safe governance systems, we've got ways we perform the transfers, checklists. We have referral systems. We have, we have a lot of systems for inter-hospital transfer. So we do have the systems. So, so how can we help? We don't have the staff really. We don't have stuff. We don't have space, but we have systems. So we are going to have to use our strength in the systems area to kind of compensate or improvise or support the other areas. So what are the unique challenges of a hospital critical care evacuation? So, I think if you look at, there's hospital MIMS and MIMS, have you heard of these courses and so on? So MIMS is kind of major incident management, and that's sort of, it's a fun course actually. You play with some toys and you create a disaster. But actually it gives you really good things in terms of the principles and the as to how major incidents are managed. But that's very much pre-hospital. And there's a hospital MIMS course that I haven't done. I don't know if you did, but it does exist in terms of how to manage a major incident in a hospital. And the unique challenge for this is a bit of both. if I'm honest with you. So actually we have pre-hospital concerns and issues, and in-hospital concerns and issues, and we don't have a, I just asked around a couple of people, and there's nothing specific about retrieval services and a major incident response. So I've had a chat with the CATS consultants, and they don't have. So we don't really have a anything to go on for this. But the general principles of designing a MI plan that I've sort of reflecting on in terms of things I've been involved in recently and things we've done well and things we've done badly is, I guess the first one is it's not going to work, but I think you need to accept that actually things are going to happen outwith of your plan, and you need to have a bit of leeway and a room to improvise. So not being too didactic with your card saying, I want you to do X, Y, and Z in this order and say that this way. Sometimes that is useful for certain things, but sometimes it isn't, because it won't allow people to think outside the box, and you'll need a bit of space to improvise. So giving people general principles and tasks rather than being too didactic. Trying to keep things as simple or as the same as it normally is as possible. So I think this is sort of reflecting on stuff that's happened before, and I'm sure a lot of us have, during COVID, we had a lot of new phones and a lot of new bleep numbers and so on, and actually we really shouldn't have done that. You know, we probably should have relied or augmented our existing communication lines rather than, oh yeah, oh, that's not the phone call, the phone for this person now, it's this, or something like that. So actually, if you change things too much, it's quite difficult. But also, I think a very big thing is you need to develop and learn every time this happens or every time there's an activation, because there's a big learning opportunity there. And it goes from being abstract to being concrete. And I think if you have an activation and you don't learn something from it, that's a real tragedy and a real shame. So I think it's sort of a reflective process. So this is, if you've done the MIMS course or anything like that, this is a standard kind of way that a major incident is declared. So if something happens, an ambulance crew will arrive on a site and they will give a methane report. And I think this is very useful. I learned this. It gives you what you need. So I think the declarations of our incident, and we could use this, or I wrote it's not a thingy, but a slightly modified version of this. But I think how we would be activated in a major incident would be something a bit modified. This is like I said, just an idea. So it'd be major. This would come from the referring site. So major incident declared in this hospital. It is this type of incident. The patients are here, because actually we can't rely on where the patients are. If they, in my wargaming, it's been an ITU that's been on fire. The number of patients and anticipated time scale. Now, we can discuss this a wee bit. We can discuss it now, actually. Do you think we need something like hazards, and maybe it should just stick with a regular methane report, or does it need a bit of modification, regardless of what that is?
I think unique circumstances. I mean, the type of incident, that's probably incorporated in type of incident. I mean, you said it fire, but if it's a failure of electricity, then it's the unique hazards are, well, there won't be any lights in the stairwell. You know, you're going to need to bring head torches and blah 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 blah. It may be specialist equipment required. If it's a fire, you know, it's a slightly different kettle of fish.
I would actually, I probably need to make this thing, but I would say that as a retrieval service, we probably shouldn't be going in. We're not going in. I think we should be able to pick somebody up from a site that we can take them away from. And if the patients are all on the 6th floor or whatever, so if it's at the London, can you get everyone down to recess and we'll pick them up from there?
So the hazard is not really relevant to us. Then, yeah.
So it depends a little bit on why we're declaring a major incident within our service, because the purpose of the kind of thing is to gear up the response in the emergency services.
Yeah.
And have them prepared for that. If we're doing it because we're going to gear up a response, we should probably stick to methane because it's universal.
Yeah.
And it goes across all services, and it's interchangeable. So if one service declares it, it can be used by another service, that methane report. I guess what we need to talk about is what our response to a methane, what a methane response means. To
Yeah.
the nectar.
I think that, I mean, a standard methane response would give enough information to get the ball rolling, I think.
So as in what that ball is.
Well, ball is. I'll show you a bit of a ball and then see. But essentially, yeah, so either and I think you're absolutely right. The interchangeability is probably incredibly useful, and I didn't quite appreciate that. But if you've got one report for one from one side, then you'd be doing that.
I've just got the sort of Nauru type bits up and just looking at that as we talk trying to see how much of the language we can keep saying.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty much the pretty similar. But the response, yeah. So so with this report would be given by the referring consultant in the normal phone call, basically.
I want to ask about your assumption of the going to communications. Thinking of our current procedures, we can get other patients, but isn't there this restraint?
Yeah, well,
would it be possible to transfer, hand over, transfer,
yeah, I think it's not necessary. They don't have to move patients, and I think this is all quite dependent on. I think this essentially comes from the infrastructure failure. And I don't know if you heard downstairs we were saying about does the hospital need to move the patients before we go and pick them up? Not necessarily, because actually, if you have a failure of oxygen, for example, it's absolutely fine. We can just go and get them from where they are. If you have the whole of the fourth floor is on fire and in this building, and we need to pick them up from the designated place of safety for that hospital, and that should be within their own major incident plans.
Yeah, so I don't think our sudden appearance should undermine their pre-planned, practiced models for how they get a lot of people out of there.
Yeah.
I think it's also if there's no lift, right? If the IT is on the ground floor, it's completely different. Whereas what we found here at the Royal London is actually you need a lot of people to get someone down the floors.
Yeah. So I think that maybe that's probably a discussion with the local unit, but I think it's not necessarily, they don't need to necessarily move them, but where are these patients, or where are the patients going to be? And essentially we'd activate the team, and I've written some ideas for action cards, and it's essentially for the duty team alone. And I've divided the crew into the ambulance side and the medical and nursing, because actually the roles are slightly different, I think, and the skill sets for that. Actually, I'll talk you through generally the principles, and then I'll sort of show the cards and what I think would happen. But like I said, we can talk it through. So Nectar Ops, in terms of what John would do, is, and this is a bit wider, but actually getting resources. So as we alluded to at the start, we don't have a lot of stuff. We don't have stuff. We don't have staff. We don't have space. So there's an order in which we need to get things. So the first one would be to create some room or find some room. And I'll come back to it. That might get a bit political. So and get a bit difficult, but I'll come back to that, and we can have a bit of a discussion about that. But essentially it's to source a lot of resources. So the resources would be, like I said, kit and equipment, space and staff, and manage that. The duty consultant would be sort of on the patient, ideally they'd relocate, but actually I think we sort of think of the model of how we work now, or if you're, if we've only got remote cover or something like that, but it would be involved in patient triage, resource allocation, matching patients to destination hospitals appropriately. And the duty crew for both sides would essentially relocate to the site and support of local transfer teams, with clinical advice, with just make sure you're essentially going to have a lot of people who, and as we move forward will have less experience with transfers, who will have to do these transfers, and they'll need a lot of support, a lot of help, and they might need to improvise as well and do things that are slightly off-piste. Let me pull up the, do you know how I can get the, is that Word document?
It should be on the desktop.
The things sharing is great.
If we can also just repeat comments made in the room.
Yeah, sure.
That way everyone can put it
Okay.
online, because we've got 20 people online trying to
Hear. Okay.
strain their ears.
So this is just a bit of a document. Actually, I don't want to just read the slides, but I'll read off it. But so if we said in terms of what the Nectar consultant has to do, a list of priorities first. So the first priority would be activate the major incident plan. And we would do activation by the normal WhatsApp group at the minute. So unless we change that. So the first thing would be get some information, and then actually this wasn't mentioned before, but this is a problem for everybody. We need to manage current and upcoming jobs. So you need to make an assumption that we are not busy. I don't know what people think about this, but well, essentially you'd proceed or abandon the jobs based on clinical needs. Essentially for the duty team, that would just be the job that's in front of you. For the consultant, that would be the job that's in front of you, but all the other jobs of the day. But I think there is a point of no return, and I think it's probably if you've departed the referring hospital. I don't know if anyone has any comments or.
It's just tricky if you're heading off to Wales.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's difficult to be didactic because it depends on the individual circumstances. But
yeah.
The duty of care is always to the patient in front of you.
Yeah.
So if they haven't been packaged, that's easy, and it's not time critical, that's easy. You just bin it.
Yeah.
But if it's time critical or the patient is packaged and in the process of transfer, then our duty of care is to that patient.
But is there what is the? Yeah, but you have to say, what is the point of no return?
The point at which it would cause potential harm to that patient to abandon that transfer. So if you're in the ambulance and you've left the referring centre, for me, you have to continue that.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on the individual circumstances. If you're going to Wales with a repat as well, and you've just set off and the Royal London's on fire, that's slightly different.
Yeah.
Potential electrical failure and you're on your way to Basildon.
Yeah.
So you know, I think that the risk-benefit equation has to be patient in front of me, what's the harm to them versus the harm to you as not being present at the major incident. You can't frame it in a kind of this is
a binary way.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to consider that we might not be available, and we might be somewhere completely random. So we might actually not have the duty crew at all available. And it's something that you need to think about. So this is for the consultant as well. So you need to gather a bit more further information. So I've tried to, and I have not succeeded, and I need a bit of help with this, gather what is the basic information we need to allocate a patient to another hospital. So the basic stuff is, and also the context that you're working in. So I'm trying to imagine a consultant intensivist whose unit is on fire, and it's not really worth going, oh, what is the pH? So what is the absolute bare minimum you'll need as a consultant to allocate a patient to a receiving hospital? And I think as a basic thing, we need the 3 points of identification. I think that's absolutely mandatory. We need to know if they're intubated and ventilated or not. We need to know if they need a filter or not, I think. Possibly not, I don't know. I think we need to know if they need specialist care, be that neuro or cardiac, which actually makes it difficult if the heart's on fire. It's but we, yeah. And well, I don't know. Actually, I'm not entirely sure. I think maybe we need to have a bit more of a further conversation. Is what is the absolute bare minimum set we need to know before we move somebody, or do we move somebody in order that the receiving hospital or the sending hospital has said, and do a shuffle later on? I don't know what.
Oh, I think the consultant, the next consultant needs to speak to the outward-facing ACCU consultant that does more than one, and come to this decision quickly, but together.
Matt, did you?
I don't know how it's changed with electronic patient records, but every unit I've ever worked with has had a fairly succinct handover sheet that is printed out twice a day or whatever. That's a PDF form of that sent across with contain quite a lot of pertinent information quite quickly to fill in some gaps.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, they do all exist. Yeah, I don't know if you heard that at home, but Matt was saying that all the ITs have a handover sheet which has a lot of information very quickly. So I think you need more information. You need enough information to make sure you're identifying the right patient. You need information to make sure that patient is going to the right place, and the order in which they're going to go. But that needs to be as seamless as possible. So
I also think that the order that they come downstairs, when they are coming downstairs, is going to be almost in reverse of complexity.
Yeah, so that's what happens with major incidents, is that the patients who arrive in the hospital first are the least complex, and then later on the more complex arrive, and they may not be the most clinically urgent. So my assumption is that we'll take the most clinically urgent first, but the reality might not be the case. And
an argument to not take the most clinically urgent first, because if they are, depending on whether it's a fire or a failure, if they're safe where they are, safe enough where they are, and we can take one other more quickly because they're a level 2 and we can just push them onto the back of the ambulance, rather than try and work out, which infusions need to go where and which ones we can stop and start. Like, that's also an argument as to not necessarily taking the most sick person first.
I think you have to, like you said, I think the problem where things go wrong is communication and lack of flexibility. So trying to force something into a predetermined plan when the incident doesn't want to go into that plan. And I think I would probably leave it as vague, because the crucial decision making in terms of priority is the communication between the ACC consultant and the nectar consultant. Because there'll be circumstances where you want to clear the lowest complexity because you've just got to get everyone off, and there'll be circumstances where you've got time and then actually want to do the most complex with the critical care service, and others coming in later can do the less complex. But I think you can't, again, it just comes down to that communication. That's the key kind of axis, is the nectar consultant and the ACC consultant agree.
Yeah, and I think it's probably, regardless of who comes out when, it's getting that patient to the right, I think getting them to the right place, or the most appropriate place the first time, is probably the best time to do it. But like I said, things might overtake that.
And when you tabletop this eventually, it might be that we pull up 3 vignettes on reflection afterwards. Scenario A, where it was get everyone out as soon as possible. Our reflection on this was simplest first, more complex, somewhere the least worst, versus the second one like Ben described. So there's a bit more time to get the most complex out, and we could have some vignettes as an appendix or something on at the end of the SOP for the duty team to just have some sort of idea of the decision making that will be going on by duty consultant and ACCU.
Yeah, the context of how fast this needs to happen is probably the bit of a rate determining step, and actually not within our remit at all, but certainly within the remit of the referring unit, is that there are some patients who might not be able to be moved at all and will be in danger, and that would need to be considered. Do you know what the P1s, the P2s, the P3s? Because of the methane, I thought I would like it to be, but I can't think of how. Nobody is a P3. Everyone's a P1. I don't know.
You can reverse it, can't you? Because level of support is in level 3. We have level 3, level 2, level 1. So you can flip it that way.
Yeah.
Suppose the 3s are the 1s, etc. But actually, what they mean is very different, because the major incident triage P1, 2, 3 is more about who's walking wounded and who you can put in the bus. And who needs an ambulance, and here they're all going to need an ambulance. And actually, level 3 doesn't tell you, level 2 doesn't tell you whether it's ventilation, it doesn't tell you what organ system. So the difference between a filter that can be off for 2 days and CPAP 80% is vast, but that'll still be level 2.
But can we not create a life system?
Do we need
Complexity, the problem.
Support.
I like the idea. I think it'd take a bit of work, and it's something very
It's a
complicated.
simplification of the triage system that works in pre-hospital systems. It's very, very simple. There is no way I can think of that you put the organ support levels of inotropes, pressors, ventilators, non-invasive. There's no simple way. I think it's got to be individualised.
Pre-hospitals predicated on a big, sort of mainly a big bang traumatic event with subsequent physiology, whereas this is well-established fluctuant trajectory on various trajectories.
Yeah.
And you could have people with a heart rate of 150 who actually just didn't keep one block and they're stable. But
I'm thinking more in terms of if you've got a fire on the fourth floor, your guys are not going to get out of the unit online and put on a ventilator on a load of things.
I think that's not our lane, though, is it?
You're not going to be able to mobilize it, and that would be fine.
That's
They need to be formalized.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. I think maybe it'll be outside of the remit of what we're going to have a chat about today, but I think it's an interest. I like the idea. I don't know how to.
A hand from Jamie. By the way, just jump in, guys,
Yeah.
because we can't really see
Can
that.
somebody just repeat whatever John was just agreeing with? Because I didn't actually hear it.
No, we were just talking about the sort of the standard P1, P2, P3 major incident system, and could we apply that to the intensive care patients? The simplicity is an attractive idea, but the reality of doing it, I think, is exceptionally difficult. And so, as an idea, I think it's great, but the practicality of doing it, I'm not entirely sure how we could square that circle.
You hear horror stories about the 7/7 bombings and the inquest that came later, and lawyers saying, well, when you looked left, did you see this patient here? How come you didn't look farther left and see my client? And you know, when it gets down to that sort of granular detail, I don't think we can simplify things down into 1, 2, 3.
And I think maybe that's not necessarily our remit.
Sorry, John, can I just jump in here for a second? Is that right?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Jamie from NCLX from UCLH.
Okay.
Really interesting presentation. It's definitely something that we also have thought about and have struggled with actually in our sector. I'd make just a quick comment about allocation of patients. You know, if you're talking about having to decant an entire ITU worth of patients, it's very likely that it will happen that London as a region will offer you beds across town. And then that's the point where you start trying to allocate patients to particular hospitals based on their particular requirements, based on the context of the incident. It might be worth, if you've not already done so, talking to Addenbrooke's about how they decanted their ITU across east of England with the recent Lassa fever outbreak. Because I think there's quite a lot of shared learning that could be done from over there.
Yeah, actually, there wasn't that much in the press about that. Actually,
it was very hush hush.
Very hard.
Actually, yeah, no, that is a good idea. I think that, and essentially, I was sort of, when I was thinking about this, like a lot of our services have been born out of a long major incident, and this is trying to do what we've been doing on a slower scale and a very fast scale. But yeah, actually, speaking with Addenbrooke's is a very good idea. I think I might do that. I'll just move on because it's sort of I'll try and get through the things. We've got plenty of time to do. But the triage and the allocation.
John,
Yes,
can
sir.
I just come in? It's John Comerford from the London Ambulance Service.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
It's an absolutely fascinating sort of scenario that you've been painting, but I think probably the key points that I think you'd be focusing on, you have to appreciate that if you declare a major incident, you automatically get a hell of a lot of resources, whether it be from LFB or London Ambulance or the Met Police, who are going to be arriving on your doorstep. And there's also a well-established command and control sort of structure that goes into play with managing all of those things coming through. So probably from your perspective in any of those types of scenarios that you presented, is really the first critical bit is actually about the identification of the threat. How serious is that? What level of response do you need to it? And then how you'd actually then try and coordinate that from that position. And probably the other point that you made at the beginning, when you were talking about your staff, systems, space, etc. One of the other things, please bear in mind, it's not just your one duty crew. Across London, obviously, every day we're putting out 4 to 5 vehicles. So depending on where they were at that particular point in time, you'd get some extra resources, specialist resources linked into critical care from that perspective. The critical bit as well, just picking up on the point about if you were on a job, in the ambulance service, we generally say if the patient's been allocated to that vehicle, you continue with that because that's your duty of care, and you're really looking around trying to find the spare resources from that position. And then again, because of the time scenario, you bring more resources in as the identification becomes clearer around the types of patients that you need to move. And part of your role probably as well would be actually instructing a lot of people to go in and actually start to move people to that safe area, which would have been designated, for example, like the car park, where again, we're very used to putting up pop-up tents and stuff like that in major incidents to hold people whilst the resource in the vehicles come in to actually support that.
Hopefully
that helps.
This is it. Can I ask you a question? Actually, since you're online, and we were
sure.
just talking about this. So there's a bit of a black hole in my knowledge in terms of what would and what wouldn't be provided. So actually, that's very, very useful. If there is so I guess we're trying to plan for a couple of different things. But if there is a evacuation in an intensive care, would we get but it's not necessarily a threat or a hazard. It's sort of like a power failure that just needs a movement of a lot of patients. Would we be allocated with an incident response officer and resources like that, or would we?
Well, yeah.
So what you get. Well, what you get within a major incident is 3 levels, if you like. You'll have somebody who's strategic, who sits outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the gold level. You then get the tactical person who's usually on site with sort of hands-on talking to people, which is what we call the silver level. And then you'll have people allocated very specific roles within the hot zone in that context, who will be responsible for very clear tasks. So, for example, somebody who's triaging, somebody who's clearing patients from the triage area, or somebody who's actually responsible for parking of vehicles. So all of that structure comes to you, and within the London response, automatically from the LES, for example, if you declared a major incident, you're going to be allocated 20 vehicles at that first instance, along with that support structure coming along behind it.
John, sorry, that's the standard pre-hospital major incident response, but I guess what we're talking about is not sort of, say, a bomb going off in the hospital, but say the major incidents that have happened recently from an IT perspective, such as almost was declared during COVID, was declared during the electrical failure, where there isn't an immediate threat to life, and there is a potential need to evacuate in a whole IT, so it's a hospital major incident. I know that didn't trigger the pre-hospital major incident response. So I guess John's question is, if it's not a standard threat major incident, pre-hospital major incident, but an in-hospital major incident, do we need to have a specific request of above and beyond mutual aid from the critical care responses?
Yes. I mean, so again, if you take the Royal Marsden fire, that did get a full major incident response in that sense. If you take the oxygen failure, that was a request that came to us and we put on some extra vehicles which went across to the site whilst everybody was sort of trying to establish whether they could get the extra oxygen that was required, but we put in place extra vehicles if we needed to move people. So again, that's where the strategic conversation, your hospital gold, needs to be talking to LFB or LES and requesting a certain level of response at that point. You've declared your major incident, we become aware of it, and then that conversation then needs to take place. So going back to that key point I said earlier, it's about very clear identification of what you really think you need in response to whatever your incident scenario is.
So from the Nectar perspective, that conversation is not ours to be had. That's the hospital goal declaring with LA. So actually the remit for our SOP is simply to level up the critical care response from mutual aid through our contacts and desk, and for potentially level up the amount of responses from Nectar.
Yeah.
That was really useful. Thank you very much. I'm just going to run through a couple of things. I want to leave plenty of discussion about. There's a couple of other issues that I've sort of identified as we would a couple. But this is in terms of what the other things the consultant would provide. I think some clinical transfer advice, but that would be along the lines of severe deviations from SOPs, which would be things like, if somebody, for example, the non-invasive transfers, or we're putting 2 patients in the one ambulance or moving somebody on an ambu bag or something like that, I think it might be worthwhile just having those conversations very quickly and seeing if that's okay. Now, in terms of tracking all transfers, I think that needs to be done with the consultant and the duty crew and the ops team. The data set in terms of what we need to allocate patients, which we need a wee bit of work on to make it quick, but we need to know what they are, who they're going with. It's a very basic thing. And I consider a stand down of a major incident for us would be when all the patients are evacuated, and that would be done via the Nectar consultant who should be there on the thing on the scene. I'll go through these quickly and then I'll just go back to the presentation. The duty crew, like I said, we've managed the current job and our commitments to the current job. The duty crew should relocate to the site of the major incident. So essentially reconfirm, I can see a position where the consultant has a plan of something, but actually the reality of what is coming to the duty crew is not quite working, or it's a different order of patients that we've planned and so on, and that's absolutely fine, and we need to be flexible with it. Highlight any problems with available resources to see if we can help with that. In terms of staffing resources, I probably didn't make it explicit enough, but if a hospital has declared the major incident site themselves, then they should be able to mobilize. They won't necessarily have enough nurses, but not enough airway trained doctors. But if you do a major incident report, you should get your anaesthetic department mobilized or free, depending on what the nature of the incident is. But I think that a big thing is we talked about those different levels of command, but the duty crew should make sure that the crews transferring the patients are appropriate and okay and safe to do it. So a quality control check. So on an extreme example, you don't want to send a novice anaesthetist with the 3-inotrope 100% oxygen patient. You make sure you've got an appropriate skill mix, that they've got appropriate kit and appropriate equipment. They know where they're going, they know how to do it. And actually, as these services mature, our skill set will increase, and the general skill set of the sort of the body of critically care trained people to do inter-hospital transfers will decrease, and we need to ensure that it's appropriate enough to do that. So there's a lot in terms of supporting local transfer teams and providing practical clinical advice and helping them out, and giving them contacts and people to speak to. So we check they're going to these patients are going to the right hospital. Are they good to go? Go through a checklist with them. I think we should provide them with a bit of paperwork as well, but we'll come back to that. But they should ensure quality and collection and transfer records and so on. The ambulance crew is, and I think that does need a bit more work, and I've scribbled some notes about that. But we talked about the current job, relocating to the site of the major incident. I think what's missing is probably, which would make life a bit easier, is if we have a time critical versus a non-time critical transfer, and it would make maybe thinking and delegating these a bit different in terms of a response from LAS. And if there's an immediate threat, like I said, we get that very big bang Marsden Fire one, whereas if it's not necessarily, you might not get that. But we need to think about things like parking, egress, access, loading, and liaising with LAS. And like I said, I'll come back to that and we can have a wee bit of a chat about it. But if we have a conventional communications failure, we are not on any of those radio networks, whereas LAS are. So actually, we'll lose everything, and they'll pretty much become our only means of communicating. As well, there is an ambulance there, and that is a transfer platform. And I think if all of our command structures are in place and working well, then we could use our own ambulance to move patients. Ops, well, basically, John, this is a list of things you're going to have to do. So. However, we were just having a chat about the wider role of the network, and actually some of this is quite political, and actually I can feel another action card coming on. But I think, but essentially, like I alluded to before, this staff stuff in space, we have some stuff, but we do not have a lot of stuff, and it's John's job to find it. But I think the main thing is to identify critical care capacity in terms of where it is. However, I don't know what it is today. How many spare beds have we got in the network?
Not many.
Not many. So actually, that's going to be an issue and a problem, and I'll come back to that. But it's where can we go to? How many patients can they accommodate? Do they have enough nurses, or will they need to keep nurses? This is not necessarily within our remit, but it's an important discussion to have as to, do we move a patient and a nurse and the nurse has to stay? And do that sending team have to send and backfill staff? Because that might be, I've written a little thing about responsibilities of sending team, I'll do that. Request of mutual aid, which we've done in the past and had a really good response. I would say that we probably just need to be wary that we don't denude the whole city of critical care transport capability. That's a bit more of a wider discussion, and do we hold a team in reserve, or do we not, or what do we do? I don't know. Ambulance assets, together with our colleagues in LAS, as to how many, and actually we probably need to have a bit more of a discussion in terms of formalizing, and I think actually following the discussions today, having a thing about a time critical threat versus actually what is time critical, what is not, might manage how we call for help. Manage resource shortages. Now, like I said, this is another issue. We are going to run out of transport ventilators first. As a personal bias, I'm very, very anti moving patients in an ambulance on an intensive care ventilator. I think that's not safe, and I'd rather you just bag them. Do we send a car around with a team to go around to receiving hospitals and pick up spare oxylogs? There are not that many spare oxylogs. Do we get some from LAS? How do we manage that? And I think we need to have a bit of a think about it. We don't have a store that we can get a lot of kit and equipment from. Do we make a case for it as a network, as a group? Possibly, I don't know. But it's something to think about. There needs to be, in terms of resources, staff as a resource, and we will have people who, we make an assumption that nobody is free, but there will be people who are free. And actually, I think if people are available and are free, then there's a bit of management of that. In terms of what they do, it's matching skill mix, and sometimes that will be physically moving patients, but sometimes it might be you might need 2 people to do the triage, or 2 people to identify all these resources or so on. So actually there's a need to support the command structure initially first, and then think about a continuity of a relief shift. If this is going to go into the night, we might need to think about exceptional working and working through the night. And then maybe think about direct transfer of patients. But it's almost the Nectar trained people should be supporting all this sort of the exceptional Nectar activity first, and then doing the direct transfer of patients secondary. And then the collating and gathering of information would be quite a big task, and I think that's a responsibility of the duty crew to make sure that the teams know what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to put it. And I think it might be easier if we have just a quick pack or an envelope with a run sheet in it, and I would like you to take a photo of this and send it to this email address. I don't know if we can talk that through, but we should have the same note keeping and governance standards that we have normally. Is there any questions, John?
Not yet, no.
Okay. So, yeah, certainly. Yeah, well, yes, actually, let me...
The question was about keeping families up to date.
Families up to date, yeah.
And whose responsibility is that?
Yeah, I was just, not my problem. I've written this little thing, and I do at the very start, and I don't know what you think about it, but essentially what we can offer in a major incident, but I'd have a look at expectations of the referring evacuations, and there's actually quite a lot, but I think it's probably quite important that we designate what we will offer and what we won't. And I think I'll just go through all of these. So I think that what I would expect from a referring site is they would activate the process, they would prioritize their patients, and we will assist with that, and provide clinical information to assist, relocate patients to a place of safety so we can move them, provide equipment, drugs and staff, which is actually quite a big ask, but actually we should say that's the thing. Inform us of any resource shortage and we'll try and do it. Appreciate that we may have the nursing is going to be an issue immediately afterwards, so that we might have to support the receiving units with medical and nursing staff, and actually that did happen when WIPS was decanted, I think, to Bart's. And I've said that that's the responsibility of the sending team, is to inform the relatives what has happened and the new location of the patient. That would be up for debate. Actually, I don't know if that might be more appropriate for the receiving site. I don't think it's the responsibility of the Nectar team. I think our responsibility is to move them. Also, I'm quite wary of context, and I think if you've got if we're just doing this mental model of an ITU that's on fire, and then we're saying, oh, actually, have you spoken to the family? And you're saying, oh, I've literally just, taken this patient through a burning building, and now I'm in Cambridge and I have to stay here for 2 days. That's quite a big ask. So I think, but I don't think that's our responsibility, but it needs to be written as to whose responsibility it is. We don't have a relationship with all of these patients. We won't necessarily have the details either, but it needs to be done.
From Jamie when you have a minute.
So yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Hey John, it's Jamie. Just to say about the equipment requirement. So there are lots of regional resources that can be called upon from EPRR routes, from NHS England and from LAS. But going forward, that's something we probably need to collectively look at together about how we actually physically access that. So I think it's clear at the moment. But yeah, there's certainly stockpiles of this stuff around that is available to come out if needed.
Yeah, I'm unaware as to how to access it. I think I know that for pre-hospital major incidents, there will be packs of certain things that are delivered to the scene, but we don't have and this is probably a pan-London approach, we might need if we institute a site evacuation somewhere, a ambulance appears with, or a truck appears with, 10 oxylogs in it or something like that. But you're absolutely right. It's how to access this and where to get it from. But I think a lot of the discussions I've seen in emails will be the thing we will run out of is transport vents, and it won't necessarily, the monitors we can get around, especially with the newer monitors. The pumps are not a problem, but it's the transport ventilators.
Yeah, so NHS England does have a stockpile of transport vents in London, which we can access. It's just A, how, and B, how long does it take?
Yeah, well, if it takes 2 hours, it's not worth it.
Yeah, I think the EPR stuff is matching that equipment to resources is really difficult.
Yeah.
It quickly. I think for the kind of maybe something to put in the SOP is probably for the either ops or the NEPTA consultant to call the red-based HEMS desk, because certainly for North East London, because for the recent electrical one, there was a stand-up simultaneously going on by LAA, and there's always risk of overlap.
Yeah.
And whereas LAA has a major incident plan that can quite quickly bring in quite a lot of teams, they won't necessarily be, some of them will be very critical care trained, but some won't be. But what they do bring is resilience in terms of equipment and transport ventilators. And also sitting next to that paramedic at the APP desk, and obviously the APPs have ventilator resources as well. So one of the first phone calls I'd be making if we needed to evacuate Royal London ITU was to HEMS desk to see what stand-up plans they were doing, if any. Because clearly if a bomb's gone off, their plan will be activated. But if it's a generator failure, they'll be thinking about it, but not really activating. I think that line of communication brings resources and personnel.
We need a clarity of who to call. I'll just go back to the presentation quickly. Just is it? Can you see it?
And might need to start.
So I've talked a little bit about the the different roles of different people, and we, like I said, we will work on these. There is a bit of an elephant in the room, though, in terms of some unanswered questions and challenges. So I just wanted to throw them out to everybody because I have no answer, and they are big, massive problems. What do we do in the middle of the night? And I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, well, this is whips, wasn't it?
I don't know, but what do we do in the middle of the night? Any ideas?
Do you want a page one system that alerts people, and very similar to the LAA page one, it goes out, it will break through your silence on your phone if you put the settings right, and it will ask you how long you could be at wherever you're needed, and that allows whoever's sending it out, i.e. probably you, John, to work out how many people
not allowed to sleep then, am I?
And the reason that's quite a good idea, even though it's very rarely needed, is it's the risks at both ends of the bell curve. Either you don't get enough people when it's absolutely needed, or they're not needed because it's actually a false alarm or a false flag, and then hundreds of people run in and there's no continuity the next day. And you want to avoid both of those. And with a page one, you can find out how many people could come in, but not activate them yet. Wait for the response and then activate what you think you need. It gives a degree of control, and it's not that difficult to set up.
Yeah, it's a stat, and all the hospitals have this.
It's actually ambulances will arrive if they're needed. And actually, we can transport people in ambulances that aren't our CT22. So ambulances will not be the resource that is needed. It will be personnel and ventilators. And those are the two things that we can probably provide out of hours if we have a ramp-up system.
Yeah, and then finding the beds is the other. So within the ODN, we're thinking about a sort of rota, an on-call rota, for the sort of person who will be doing the political machinations of.
Well, I'll get to the politics.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's even harder out of hours.
but it's out of hours. You've got an issue with. Yeah, I think the page one's something to consider.
Yeah.
And what do we do with it? Who goes on it? How do we get that? And actually, we don't have a formal. On a really basic level, we don't have a formal referral process out of ours, so there will not be necessarily somebody at the end of the phone.
The phone line isn't active after 10.
Yeah.
It goes dead.
So
it could have a message on it, couldn't
it? It could do.
If this is an emergency, please
ring me repeatedly.
That could be,
That's sorted
that
then.
could be
Is
a-
it?
I'm going to say, John, I think the solution is just call John Dean for all of the
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Just make it John Dean's problem. Thanks, John.
Yeah, that's it.
So out of hours, that could be something we ask Hem's desk to have probably. They're used to knowing when to activate page one for pre-hospital reasons. They're staffed out of hours, as long as it was a really clearly articulated thing when to wake up a bunch of intensivists and anaesthetists out of hours with page one. That's
Evacuation of an intensive, evacuation of intensive care.
And maybe we, sort of thing, we rebrand this as an evacuation protocol rather than a major incident thing, because actually there are some things confounding it. So I think that the time critical versus non-time critical and evacuations, there's different needs for different urgencies. Okay, I'll move on to another elephant in the room. Yeah. So John's in front of me and he loves a WhatsApp group. What do we do if we lose our WhatsApp groups?
NHS London, this is actually their current, one of their wargaming scenarios. There's a fear, especially with the ongoing war in the Near East, is what happens if there is a cyber attack that not just brings down, say, Cerner, which has happened before, but brings down a mobile network, or brings down, power generator that isn't just at rural London, but across all of Northeast London, leaving, the routers dead, and how hard it is to get phone signal, and even when on a good day. Tetras.
Well, the airways are very precious.
Yeah.
You may struggle to prize one
No way.
for our service, but that is how the other services will communicate.
Medical student runners.
Get them on page one as well.
Yeah, I think on a really basic level, we probably need a bit of a file in the office with a list of phone numbers and locations, and if we say the phone networks are working, but the internet isn't or whatever, then do we just physically pick up an old-fashioned landline and phone around all these ITUs and so on, because that exists for theatres. There's a big list of people, a list of phone numbers, a list of places, and so on. So we probably need that. It's a bit mundane, but yeah. But I think we really have to think about that, because actually we are very reliant on WhatsApp, especially in Nectar, and it doesn't work. We're screwed. Another one, paperwork, documentation, and packs. So I think I'm making an assumption that the app will not be usable for this, because actually we'll have a lot of people who. So there's a couple of different things. It's we've got a standard paper run sheet, and I think that's fine. We need to. It's going to be completed by people who don't normally complete it, but actually I think that's okay because it's reasonably straightforward. I don't think there's anything particularly controversial there.
They're not being printed anymore.
Oh, they're not being printed anymore, right? So what do we do?
Could we not just go with the standard ITU to CT transfer, full AAGBI monitoring throughout, no significant complications, patient handed over?
In extremis, yes. Or most people will be familiar with an anaesthetic chart. You don't necessarily have to do the whole shebang, airway assessment, but at least it's got a place for past medical history, 3 points of identification, current problem, and then a grid for some seagulls.
If everyone's on fire, though, they're not going to be pulling out anaesthetic charts. They're going to be taking patients.
I would
argue
that we give them we provide these for them. It's not going to take up a lot of space, and
or just a little plastic folder with here's everything you need.
Yeah. Yeah, but actually, how we make these packs up is it would need a wee bit of work. But actually, if you sort of here's an envelope, here's your patient, here's your bed, this is your destination, this is the phone number.
I think it's a good QI project for someone just to make up, because there'll be times outside of crises that we have
failures.
I volunteer as tribute.
we should anyway have a little paperwork folder back up.
Seriously though, I'm happy to help with that, John and Ben.
And also things like just a tip sheet for the bedside nurse, X number of hours of meds, a pre-transfer checklist for people who may well work in critical care and sector services but haven't done sort of off the site.
But I think that'll be, well, pre-departure maybe, but I think the stuff that happens upstairs is, yeah. Otherwise we end up duplicating work and oh, you haven't ticked the boxes.
But I think it's something to have a think about.
But we need to make sure that they do it.
And do we keep packs on the ambulance, or do we have to come back here and pick it up, or go there?
Should be
Because you could, if it's not going to be that big and it's not going to take up that much space, so you could. And what's the worst case scenario is evacuate the London, maybe 40 something.
44.
Yeah.
But of which 20, let's say half of them are ventilated and really need to move others.
Yeah. But it's something to think about. Equipment shortages, actually, we touched on, and I think maybe the main thing from that is we need to formalize what we are going to do, come up with a plan, because we know this is going to happen, and it's going to be ventilators, and we know they're out there. We don't necessarily know how to access them appropriately.
And then there's the problem of incompatible equipment. I mean, we've got a lot of Hamilton circuits on board, but how many Oxylog circuits have we got kicking around?
Functional units.
We've got 2 Hamiltons and
no,
600.
we need like the ventilator and the thing.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah,
but I mean, that means we can't supply the Oxylog circuit. Where are they?
Well, I think, again, it's one ventilator per team.
Yeah.
Because you're going to put them back on another ventilator and come back. So actually, we're only limited in ventilators by the amount of teams that can muster.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the hospital major incident will muster some teams. Maybe through us standing up an LAA, we can put together more transfer teams. But then again, I think teams will come with some ventilators. So the hospitals will come with a couple of Oxylogs and their ventilators. Again, the MPPs have ventilators with circuits. LAA have ventilators with circuits. So the only resource I'm not sure about is the EPR ventilator and circuit backup and how to access that. But that would be for a slow burn incident, I suspect.
Yeah, I think maybe we just need to do a bit of fact finding and sort of see what we can, where it's going to come from, because it's not going to be us. That's a definite thing. Politics. So I think, so basically if we evacuate an intensive care, we are essentially creating there's a major incident on one site that's going to become a major incident on a lot of sites. And that's very, very political. And I think that's out with the remit of us in terms of authority. But I think we can inform the decision by saying we need X amount of beds within the network, but it will take somebody at a high up level to stop asking for support and start telling people they are going to give support, because I think we are, like I said, there's not that many beds available now. We couldn't absorb one intensive care into the rest of the network right now, I'm sure, without activating some surge capacities. And I think that is a political decision that needs to be agreed by all of the hospitals in the STP. I don't know what you think about.
No, I agree with you. I this isn't Nectar's role. This has to come from essentially hospital gold in combination with ODN. And I just vaguely remember when the Royal London last needed a potential evac. Ben, were you on at Barts? And you basically went, if you can send the nurses, I can take 8, right? And so it is partially sort of volunteered in an ad hoc manner, on the understanding that we'll make space, because any space is better than the space that you currently have by definition. But and then sort out the complications later in terms of repatriation, tertiary needs, bringing the surgeons to the patients or whatever. But you're right. I think Nectar will be activated when or concurrently with the ODN to say, I've got 22 patients who must move and 20 more who should, and therefore I need that many beds. How many can we find in Nell? Okay, that means we need to ask NHS London for XYZ number, and all of that I'd be comfortable doing, but we just need to be very clear about what the ask is. And when we push that button, it's very hard to unpush.
Yeah, I think and I'm sort of, what we'll be doing to the receiving trusts is significant because we might be scuppering them for a long
turning off
time.
theatres
And I think I think there probably needs to be a position where it's not an ask and it's a tell. Because nobody is going to want to do this really. And there's a tell about the politics of opening up the surge capacity and creating a major incident in a lot of different hospitals, and a tell about the staffings from the receiving side that's not, I wouldn't like to be in the position where I'm sent to another hospital and made to stay with the patient, but that is going to have to happen. And there needs to be a understanding that has to. So there is a wider political thing, and I think, as you alluded to, it needs to be discussed and as to who will make that decision and what to be done.
Yeah.
Any comments about that?
I just think that you're right. Nectar can help inform this, but you can lean heavily on the ODN here, and that's what it's there for.
Okay.
From an entirely naive point of view, though, if every hospital would be happy to send patients if they were on fire, surely they should be happy to receive patients if somewhere else is on fire.
I don't think that's the problem necessarily. It's not going to be a willingness issue. It's going to be a practicalities issue in saying, all right, yes, you know, we can help, right? And I, as say the ITU consultant at Newham, want to help, but you know, Gateway's still open. I've got 2 in theatre, and my hospital Silver is on leave, and so the HDoc says, well, hang on, why can't Whips take? You know, and then it starts getting into this where. And I'm using these names, hospitals, generically, but at some point, someone helicoptering over just needs to say, right, enough, cut through the crap. Here's who's taking how many.
I think we were joking about it before we started, but it's NATO for critical care.
With the missiles.
So just, I'm just going to finish up because I think this is actually, it's been a very useful discussion. There is going to be a significant, and this has happened with all of the major incidents, regardless of what it has been, the aftermath and the tail is long and prolonged. And for Nectar, there is going to be a lot of patients in the wrong place or in temporary places. So the retrieval activity across London is going to be significant for a number of days, I would imagine. So that needs to be factored and taken into account. So whether that be backfilling an exceptional night shift, or standing up more teams in the following days, or trying to or holding exceptional meetings within the network and trying to see who can be repatriated and where, because depending on the nature of the incident and how quickly it's been resolved, but that needs to be taken into account. Another thing in the aftermath is there needs to be a degree of debrief and learning. So the debrief should focus on the support of the team involved, but also refining of the process, refining of the SOP. This is all theoretical at the minute, based on some things that have happened. But actually, when this happens for real, or when we have to do it or have to exercise it, we are absolutely duty bound to learn something from this every time we do it, because it will not necessarily work out the way we have assumed or we have planned. Good. Any other questions at all? Because I don't want to overrun.
The only thing just on the aftermath bit that came to me is, in a way, should we repatriate? Is that an unacceptable risk? Are we subjecting a patient to an unnecessary transfer for politics? Or is it, well, what do we...
It's a political decision.
It's a political one, isn't it? Yeah. But then, you know, you're restoring capacity to the hospital that's very kindly offered to help. It's almost, you know, a given. As soon as you can take it back, you will.
Very good. That's all I was going to cover today. What I'll do is I've taken a couple of notes. I'm going to do a wee bit of a refresh of the stuff that I've written already, and some suggestions of things we need to do, and then I'll circulate it amongst the groups. But this is going to be very much a work in progress, and I think it'll be refined. Also, a pan-London approach would be great. So that's something I'm very happy to.
Yeah. So I think once we have this rough draft, then I'd like to circulate it within Nectar, but also within the other services and LAS, and the various EPR teams. Nina McLean's been involved here. She's head of EPR here. And I think she would love to see what our plans are, because this is any evacuation is going to be a multi-organizational, complex piece of machinery with a dozen moving parts, of which we're just one. But their input would be valuable, especially because someone's going to know where all the oxylogs are, etc., etc. Right. Thank you so much, George. Big thank you to John, who's done a lot of work on this. Obviously, as you can tell, it's a huge piece of work, and still one in progress, as you mentioned, but one that is definitely coming together and bringing a lot of learning from the various crying wolf / false alarms we've had over the last year. So we're moving on to coffee next, I believe. Let me just pull up our agenda. And then, yeah, we're gonna have some coffee, and then KP's going to be talking about a really interesting